It's called Adolescence. It's on Netflix. It's a limited series. It's pretty new, but people are big mad. There is going to be a ton of spoilers in this, okay? So if you want to watch it spoiler free, which to be clear, kind of the premise of everything that we have to talk about is a big spoiler for the show. So if you don't want spoilers, I tell you now, spoiler, 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 don't watch this. I will be clear though, the acting in this show is so good. So good. The cinematography, so good. Layla, the episode 3 is the best one. I don't think episode 3 was like all bad. I think there were some really good parts, like especially the boys wrestling. But I was very underwhelmed by the way that they wrote the psychologist, I think specifically. Is the show based or is it not based? I think a lot of incel people that are angry over the race stuff is just kind of cringe. I just don't think that that's like the important part of the story, right? I think, for example, changing the race of like certain like fantasy characters can sometimes be meaningful and sometimes not. So is the show portraying boys primarily as victims or as the perpetrators? The show is showing both. If I'm being honest, my read of the show is that while the perpetrator is the young boy who's being bullied about Manosphere stuff and does seem to have some more sexist views of women, but not like egregiously sexist. I would say really standard sexist, like especially working class sexist perspectives. So like just really standard. Not that I'm saying that that's good before anyone freaking out, being like, it's not a good thing. I'm just saying this is what we should expect. I don't know if I'd be willing to like start flinging the word like incel at a 13-year-old boy, right? So while he is the perpetrator, the whole story is analyzing him and his family and his brain to understand like what led him to doing this crime. There's actually very, very little time spent on the girl, probably for twofold. Number one, her bullying this boy doesn't justify him murdering her. Obviously, right? This is obvious. There is no amount of bullying that suddenly makes physically assaulting and killing another person okay. This is obvious. Probably don't need to murder bad, okay? But what's interesting is trying to like get into the head of this kid and why he felt enough rage that he snapped and did this behavior. So here's episode 3. He's being interviewed by a forensic psychologist who's doing an independent review, basically of his psychology. She's trying to understand who he is and how he thinks, which I think is a really, really cool premise for a 3rd episode. And it's 50 minutes. It's very long, but we'll see why Brain Pilot thinks that it's perfect. And maybe they'll convince me.
Is one of Netflix's latest releases, and it's one of the most talked about shows that's out there at the moment. It jumped straight to #1 in the Netflix charts, and it provided a lot of talking points around the subject matter of the show with regards to incel culture, toxic masculinity, and the impact that your child being a murderer can have on the family. But also, there's been conversations about the way that this show was constructed, with Philip Barantini at the wheel with his signature single-take shots setting the tone, pace, and rhythm for this extremely interesting and dark show. Within the 4 episodes, there was one episode in particular that stood out to me, and it was the 3rd installment. An installment where there were only 4 characters that featured, and the intensity of a character profile being built for pre-sentencing was what the intention of it was. From phenomenal performances to an incredible use of sound.
She did do it. I would agree with you on that, Layla, yeah. In fact, I think I should be more clear. I think the portrayal of the psychologist was almost perfect, except for in 2 ways that I think only served to take away from her character, which I'll get into. Otherwise, I think that her character portrayal was really, really strong. I think she showed enough like rapport building and empathy while also making enough space for it to just be about him. There was just 2 things that I thought were disappointing to see written in.
to an ending that then left me in complete shock and feeling like all emotions had been drained from me. I wanted to discuss why this episode was simply perfect and explain why it's worthy of all of the praise.
Also, all the actors and actresses, I just want to say again, incredible. Her acting, incredible. The boys acting, incredible, incredible, incredible. Amazing acting. 50 minutes straight of just really powerful and subtle acting. I love subtle acting. She's a really brilliant subtle actress too.
That it's been getting. So let's get into it. Here is why Adolescence episode 3 is perfect. Just to let you know, this video will contain a character that was at the center of this episode, and ERUDITE delivered a phenomenal performance from start to finish. To be honest, I'd just come off the back of watching 1,000 Blows, and I half expected her to sound like a character that came from the East End, but instead she sounded very posh and proper. So in seeing that range, it instantly made me feel like we were in for one hell of a performance. ERUDITE, like Owen Cooper, went through a range of emotions in this episode with their character, but it was only at the end of it where we saw that her mask was let down and the emotional weight and turmoil of everything that she'd been through in just needing to be in a room with the killer, Jamie, got the better of her. And she could finally release it all and let out what felt like the largest of metaphorical exhales. When looking at the start of the episode, she was smiley, friendly, and went out of her way to make Jamie feel comfortable in getting him his hot chocolate with marshmallows, even joking with him about their regional differences when it came to slices of bread and their backgrounds. But by the end of it, after she'd been intimidated not once, but twice, her whole demeanor was different, and we saw a more closed-off, stare-you-down approach, which ultimately allowed the character to get what she wanted in being able to profile Jamie. Doherty's performance was extremely intense due to the nature of the character that she was playing, but despite that intensity, there was confidence, believability, sympathy, and fear in knowing that she had to sit across from an evil human being like Jamie with the unpredictable nature that he had.
Oh, the evil human being that is Jamie. Yikes. This is actually really tied to my very unpopular take. Surprisingly, it's really comforting and easy, I think, to label an individual as evil. To be clear, the action that he did is unquestionably evil, right? The character murdered a girl. That's really bad, just in case everyone's wondering. That is an evil action. But I often feel frustrated in a really deep sense about how it's very easy to characterize people who do really bad things as evil in a way to shield ourselves from trying to understand the terrifying psychological similarities that we have to people who do really bad things. And this, like, to me, is really driven home. This is something that we talk about in psychology, and I'm coming from a psych perspective on this time and time again, right? This is the the Milgram's test. This is, if you don't know what the Milgram's test is, it's basically where they could get normal average citizens to deliver what was labeled as like killing levels of electrical volts to somebody who was just failing a test in another room because they were asked to do so, right? I think it's really, really important to understand the banality of how often evil occurs, right? Especially in a crime like this. This is a crime of passion, right? He gets really angry. He's a very angry young boy. I think one of the things that this episode highlights super well that we haven't really known yet is how angry and kind of explosively angry Jamie is, right? It highlights it being like, oh, this is a boy that I could see doing violence against a girl. Like I can see it because he keeps on being explosively angry. And at the same time, while what he did was an evil action, unquestionably, when we label this person as just evil, we now are no longer required to psychologically understand that individual whatsoever, or to confront the parts of us that if just enough wrong steps occur in our lives, we could be in that same position. This is also a concept in restorative justice. Yes, if you believe in rehabilitative justice or restorative justice, you basically can't really label most people evil. I would be willing to grant that true-born psychopaths are probably the only people that I'd be comfortable categorically labeling as evil, right? Because there's nothing that can compel them to stop doing bad things except for like self-interest. But that's only because we don't have the technology or knowledge enough to fix that. I imagine that there's probably a brain thing going on with psychopaths that if like could be corrected or offset, I would feel differently about that person being evil. I just think functionally I treat psychopaths like, particularly like violent prone psychopaths as like true evil, right? Because rehabilitative justice doesn't work for them whatsoever. There's a Joker in all of us, just one bad. Well, the important part of like the Milgram experiment, because it came out of Nazi Germany, is just to understand that there is a Nazi in all of us. And if you aren't, and this is to be clear, there are people who don't have a Nazi in them because they've done enough of the self-work to analyze themselves, to have a moral system that is born of their own thought, and therefore can resist evil when the banality of it pulls you in, right? Because there were Germans who resisted the Nazis. There were Germans who stood up against them. There were Germans who shielded and protected Jewish people. So of course this is true. But to be that person, there is some level of self-work and self-knowledge that has to occur. And so when you say that person's just evil, it's extremely concerning because it's like, have you done the work necessary to protect yourself from that same thing? Das Wave is a German movie, kind of about the same thing, that is really brilliant in kind of posing this question of basically being like, who are the people that can resist becoming evil in a banal, through banal, evil through a banal process? Who are the people that can resist becoming evil through banal processes? Because that's how most people become evil. It's through super small little moments. Okay. It's called Das Wave. It's in German. If you ever want to watch it, it's older. It's great though.
We didn't know anything about Bryony, other than the profession that she did and the fact that she liked to take things seriously. And I think it takes great skill to make the audience care for a character when there's no true backstory that's known.
True.
So I think Doherty's performance was what ultimately enabled that to cut through. The sheer disgust that was on her face at the end and the single tear that ran down it showed that emotional turmoil that she went through in the 5 sessions that she had with Jamie. Plus, I'd also say certain moments where she also shone was when Jamie was revealing what he could have done to Kate, and the room fell silent, and all we heard was her heartbeat and her breathing. The stillness on her face and body and the emotionless expression that she held actually spoke 1,000 words, and it was probably one of my favourite moments of Doherty's in this episode. Owen Cooper's performance as Jamie. Considering this was Owen Cooper's first ever acting role, and episode 3 was the first episode that was shot in the entirety of the show, his performance was absolutely class. Not only did we see innocent—
Wait, this was the first episode shot? That's crazy at an actor's level.
In the boy at the start with the childlike attitude that he held, but by the closing moments of the episode, we saw the evil, toxic, murderous capability that he held within him due to the confrontation and the switch in personalities that happened.
I literally feel like this is a movie reviewer who does not get movies. I feel like I'm listening to somebody being like, man, I watched Everything Everywhere All at Once and I realized, you know, what's really important? To work hard in life. And it's like, that's not the point of the movie. Just so it's clear, this is not my takeaway from the movie at all, right? When I see, for example, her struggling, probably part of the brilliance is that I don't know entirely what I think the writer's doing. I do think the writer leans in the direction of what this person's saying about basically like a certain level of villainization of men, and particularly violent men or violent young boys. However, they really kept it neutral. For example, when the first time the boy erupts at her, he like gets in her face, he's really threatening, he throws a chair, he's really explosive. They showed her basically like tearing up and needing to step away. I feel a little bit odd about that as somebody who's worked with very violent, angry young boys before and worked underneath and been like mentored by people who make this their profession, right? They're her, you know, I've followed these people and I've worked in these spaces. Because if you're doing forensic analysis, which this woman would be probably some level of a forensic clinical psychologist, young boys being violent who are incarcerated would not be this shocking, kind of like disgusting experience for you. This is, thanks, I money, I honey. This is like par for the course, right? When I've seen situations, for example, when we've been like in a lockup detention facility, one of the boys has a violent record, is threatening one of the staff, right? Being really like aggressive and whatnot. It can be very scary in the moment, right? Obviously, it's scary to have somebody be physically threatening you. But the walk away emotions that most people in this field have isn't one of disgust. Most people who work in these spaces don't feel disgust for their young male clients. And to be clear, if you do, I'll try to, it didn't help. If they do, it's probably not the right industry for them, right? So like her ending scene where she has what I would agree is a look of disgust was actually kind of disappointing. In large part because I feel like it perpetuates this idea that young men who are violent in this way are like wholly unredeemable, which I think is I don't think that the kid in the show is acting. What? Yes, he is. I don't know if the idea that young violent men are irredeemable is the type of judicial and societal response that we should have or idealize or think is the right response, right? The psychologist walking away feeling disgust and this movie brain pilot guy feeling that Jamie is evil and that it was so satisfying and, and harrowing to see her reaction and be like, oh yeah, he's just so evil, is basically the opposite of what we need when it comes to rehabilitative justice, right? If most of the crime is done by young, angry men, which it is, particularly young, angry men who are on drugs or alcohol, the way that we engage in rehabilitative justice for these young men isn't to call them evil and to view them as disgusting. It's to have empathy for why they're so angry and then teach them healthy outlets for that anger. In large part because we understand, for example, that the way that young men and boys in general tend to express things like anxiety and depression is through irritability, anger, and anhedonia, right? We know that when men and boys are angry, again, at an aggregate level, they're not going to express their anxiety and depression as like crying all the time, being sad, laying in bed, and like not being able to like get out of bed and worrying all the time about like what their friends think. What they're going to have is constant irritability, lots of anger issues, punching the walls, destroying things, and anhedonia. They can't get pleasure out of anything, right? These are the signs of anxiety and depression in men, which is why I'm really disappointed with the way that psychology typically evaluates anxiety and depression, because it makes it like this woman issue when I am at this point, I don't even know if I buy that at all. Not only does it do this shitty thing where it perpetuates this idea that women are just like more neurotic and more anxious and sad, but it also then creates this like dishonest understanding of the way that sadness and anxiety expresses in men and young boys, and we misdiagnose it. Because in general, we think anger is a very bad thing. We don't like that emotion. We don't empathize with angry people very well. We empathize with sad, cute, scared things, right? If I'm anxious and being irritable, nobody thinks I'm cute. They think I'm a bitch, right? When I'm anxious and crying in a sad small bean, everyone wants to protect me. This is like obviously true. This is like the meme of white woman tears. And so the way that they had this woman be tearful twice and then like look at him when he leaves with like sheer disgust felt very detached from the reality of the work that most clinical psychologists are doing. Most clinical psychologists that work with forensics, so typically young boys, they don't hate their clients. They don't think their clients are disgusting. And it makes me worried when I see like coverage like this saying like, it was perfect, you know, it was so satisfying to, what did he say?
In the 5 sessions that she had with that to cut through. The sheer disgust that was on her face at the end and the single tear that ran down it showed that emotional...
Right? I don't know if I'd say that was sheer disgust. I feel like Brain Pilot is putting his own emotional reaction to his feelings about Jamie on her. She's clearly distressed. She's clearly distressed and very, very disturbed by what he said. Unquestionably. I don't know if I'd say that she's just got sheer obvious disgust, but it's concerning to me that this is such a large takeaway from this episode, when in fact, what I saw is a clinical psychologist who was stressed, very worried about the fact that this young boy held all these beliefs. Because at one point he goes like, "You're not the queen," right? He's very kind of aggressively misogynistic at a couple of times, very much doing weird power games with her throughout. He does things like trying to embarrass her. For example, like he says, like after he scares her, she sits close and like confronts him with some of his comments towards the girl, Katie, the girl that he killed. And he tries to embarrass her, for example, which is, just so it's clear, the writing on the boy side, super, super well done and accurate to like what an angry young boy looks like, right? A very, like when I say an angry young boy, I mean like a forensically level angry young boy, like a violent, does assaults, in this case, does a murder young boy. Doing power games. Like when I worked at the lockup, I remember everything that I saw in this. I was like, I remember my clients doing this. I remember, for example, there was this one time, it was my biggest pet peeve. God, I fucking hated this, where my young male clients, when they were mad at me, they'd go like this. Or even sometimes when they weren't mad at me, they just go like this and they'd be like, "See, you flinched." And I'm like, "Yeah, of course. You were pretending like you might punch me. I'm not stupid. Of course I flinched." Drove me crazy, by the way. So fucking annoying. Where they were like, "Ha, ha, 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 ha." And it's like, "Bro, you're fucking stupid. If I ran at you with a shovel and pretended to hit you in the face, you flint." Yeah, no shit. It drove me crazy. Okay? Right? So like those behaviors, I think were really accurate. Really, really well done. The power games as well, of being like, "What, you think you're the queen?" Those like misogynistic power games. So common. Again, as somebody who's like worked with forensic boys. Did you ever do it back? No. Are you kidding me? That is just setting myself up for an assault, like unquestionably, right? And again, the boys going like this to me, it's bad of them to do that. And also, like the boy who would do that to me, he was sexually assaulted chronically from the ages of 4 till 10. He was, I'm not sure what caused this, but he had a severe brain injury, basically from pretty early on, that left like a large portion of his frontal lobe missing. He basically, because of how like violent and outburst he was functionally homeless. He was technically in a group home, but he could never stay. He got kicked out all the time. He was in and out of jail, in and out of drug rehab. He was addicted to meth, right? And so it was bad of that boy to do this. It's wrong of this young boy to kill a girl, obviously. But we're never going to solve the problem of like young male violence if our response to them is, "You're just evil, unforgivable, and disgusting." That's not what rehabilitative justice is. That's just not. This is what I talked about before. Empathy is really fun when it's a cute small bean who's just crying in her room or his room. Empathy is really hard when it's a kid who's flinching and trying to pretend to hit you, or who's calling you a bitch, or who's being nasty, right? Empathy is really hard in those situations. And empathy doesn't mean telling the person, "It's okay that you killed the girl." No, it's not. That's not empathy. Empathy is saying, what you did was deeply wrong, and you will live with it for the rest of your life. And you are going to be buried with shame for most of it. And also, there is a path to redemption if you're willing to take it and walk that path. And it'll be really hard. And I guess depending on your relationship, and as much as I can be, I want to be alongside you on that pathway to redemption, right? That's what empathy is. Okay.
Turmoil that she went through in the 5 sessions that she had with Jamie. Plus, I'd also say certain moments where she also shone was when Jamie was revealing what he could have done to Kate, and the room fell silent, and all we heard was her heartbeat and her breathing. The stillness on her face and body and the emotionless expression that she held actually spoke 1,000 words, and it was probably one of my favourite moments of Doherty's in this episode. Owen Cooper's performance as Jamie. Got in the innocence in the boy at the start with the childlike attitude that he held, but by the closing moments of the episode, we saw the evil, toxic, murderous capability that he held within it.
Sociopaths can't feel shame. You can't guilt trip them with some empathy sobbing. I'm sorry. I don't know what empathy sobbing is, but just so it's clear, okay? Somebody's telling you their life story about their abuse, and it's really sad and hard. And your response while they're telling you about this tragedy is to start fucking crying and needing to be comforted. That's not empathy. That's not empathy. Might be sympathy. That's not empathy. And it's also stupid because it just makes them have to take care of you. This is like the most classic like dynamic. Like, I know so many people that have really difficult relationships with like emotionally tiring people because every time they talk about their own personal problems, the other person gets so upset that they feel like they have to console them, which is a very exhausting. So I don't know what you're talking about with this empathy sobbing thing, but nobody's talking about this. I have at no point have said that the boy who flinched and punched at me, who, by the way, I was one of the only staff that could empathize with him because I don't know.
Where do you think the value that male violence has provided in human history plays into this? And do you see any value in looking up to positive violence like superheroes?
I do. To go back, sorry, I wasn't the only one that could empathize with him. I was the only one that, for whatever reason, could get through to him. Mostly, weirdly enough, because he had like this massive blow up at me, was being a fucking asshole. And I basically started like cracking in my voice a little bit. And I was like, and the whole week I'd been kind to him, except for when he was being a dick. And then I was like firm with him, obviously, and like sent him to his room. But other than that, I would play games with him. I would just like treat him like normal. And I didn't go around like correcting his language all the time. But I started cracking and I was like, bro, I just need you to go to bed. Like, you have to go to bed. This is how this works. This is my job. I understand that you're like scared and you don't like to go bed by to your own room by yourself. I get it. I understand that. But you have to go anyways. And he just like softened and he was like, yeah, I am really scared. And I was like, I know. And he was like, can I at least like leave my door open? Because they had to keep their doors closed. And I was like, tell you what, I will sit outside your door that's open and I will play you. I'll like read, I think I read him a book. And I was like, I'll read you a book. And all the other kids, I let the kids all crack their doors. I'll read you a book until you like are reasonably falling asleep or my shift ends. And then I'm going to close the door. And he's like, sure, deal. We did that. And from then on, it was literally crazy. He would just listen, right? And so I'm not saying that everyone has to do that. I'm not saying that everyone has to go to that extent. You just can't be the one adding on top and pointing at the kid that's like threatening to punch me or whatever and be like, you're evil. There's no redemption for you. Except for you. There's no redemption for you, Freya. You will never have my taquitos ever again. You're a big bad girl who's naughty and deserves no taquitos. Empathy is fine unless it never amounts to a... Empathy is just always fine. What's not fine is enabling, but these are not the same thing. Do not equate these two things. Hi, Nina. Thanks for the raid. Thanks for the raid, Nina. Sorry, I'm so sorry you raided earlier and I didn't notice. Therapists shouldn't think I want to help this person. Instead, they think, can this person really be helped? Zed Snapper, you have no idea about mental health. Please stop talking about it. You don't know what you're talking about. A therapist's first question to themselves shouldn't be, is this client worthy? Okay, that is not the starting question for mental health work at all. Oh, you put tariffs on Freya's taquitos? Yeah, 200%. She can't pay up.
Due to the confrontation and the switch in personalities that happened several times. It genuinely felt...
Make sure you go back and answer that super chat.
Oh, shit. Can you send it to me? Oh my God. Okay, I got it. Where do you think the value that male violence has provided in human history plays into this? Do you see any value in looking up to positive violence? Yes. Oh, this is such a good question. I think the way that our very privileged society engages with violence is super understandable and really lovely, and also leaves us woefully unable to have a good theory. Thank you. A good theory of violence. And by theory of violence, this is a term I have made up, but it's a derivative of probably somebody smarter than me has said it once. I probably didn't actually make it up. I just think I did. But it's essentially this idea of how you come to understand violence complexly. A lot of people would say all violence is bad. And then I'd say, well, what about self-defense? And they'd be like, well, okay, that's fine. It's like, okay, so it's obvious that there are some morally good versions of violence, right? If you see a grown man grabbing a little girl and trying to shove her into a van, and you walk up to that man and you smoke him in the head with a bat, that's probably good violence. Good job. Theory of violence made up. True. The term theory of violence. I think it's a good term, though. But I think examples of violence being used to protect the weaker, to protect people who can't protect themselves, and to like help others who can't otherwise help themselves in major physical ways is good, right? I think it's very good, because I think that is necessary at times. That is a necessary reality of the world. I don't think that ultimate physical pacifism is going to be achieved, at least in my lifetime. What I think is concerning is violence that's getting idealized, that's about like vengeance or revenge or just like power seeking, right? I think that that's where there's probably more complex conversations that need to happen. Because I think that by and large, I'm not really for those forms of violence. But also, I don't have the most mature theory of violence. While I agree that most of our society has a very immature theory of violence, I'm not pretending that I have some overly mature theory of violence and others. I've never even really, like, I don't think I've even like been in a fight before. Like I've never like punched somebody, right? Like ever. I've been in like restraints where I've like restrained violent children, but I don't know if that quite equates. I've never had to deal with like anger and rage that's so big that I end up punching somebody or somebody ends up punching me. I've never been a male who has to like navigate this dynamic of like some level of like mutual deterrence because you both know that you could do a lot of harm. In fact, I have a theory of violence more femme-built, which is like, by and large, violence is going to be a bad situation for me. So I am going to avoid it at maximal possibility because I'm going to die because I'm small and weak comparatively, which is what I think a lot of like fear that women experience around men that is legitimate and born out of is this idea that women have to reconcile forever in their entire life, that most men walking around them, if they chose to, could kill them and harm them, right? And like holding some dialectical space where that's the reality, and also we can't just hate men. That's probably not the solution, right? What we need is to create a form of masculinity that's healthy, and we desperately need to because of the stakes. Which is why when I hear red femmes being really frustrated about male violence, I really deeply empathize. I think that that is a deeply, deeply empathizable position to have. And I think when men dismiss that, they're really lacking insight into like an other's experience.
Like different characters. I mean, look at it. Kind boy that wants a hot chocolate. Murderous boy that will stab you 7 times if he doesn't get what he wants. His expressions and tone would just switch on a dime if something was said to him that he didn't quite agree with or made him feel uncomfortable. There would just be this look in his eye and smirk in his mouth that would show that he'd switched, and that child inside of him was gone for those moments. So it was really impressive to see. The coldness in the delivery of lines such as, "Did I scare you when I shouted? I'm only 13. That's embarrassing. It showed the heartless nature that the boy had, and it was the first time we'd seen him acting in such an evil way.
Ugh.
As when we first saw...
It was terrible coverage. Base. The whole point of the show was to not make Jimmy out to be psychopathic. The point was to show that this could happen to anyone, and we as society don't know what we're doing when it comes to guiding and protecting young people. Base. Like, what will we do in a few years when you have to live with an adult who's Jamie's just hadn't done anything violent yet, but have been radicalized and retired? Yes. Based. True. Good job, Heather. I think tangentially, in general, I don't like use the word violent for emotional and psychological stuff. I'd use like aggression and like confrontation, but yeah. Kyle, question: if you're walking on the street and you encounter a kid and you encounter an intruder kidnapping a kid, what are your two options? Would you fight off the intruder? A crazy question. And save that kid, or would you walk away and go by your business like nothing happened? What an insane question. I think I'd put my headphones in and put on my favorite true crime podcast. I'd do something. I'd probably if I saw like a violent kidnapping occurring in front of me, I would start screaming at the top of my lungs for help. I would start screaming at the person, and I would probably try to intercede in some way. It obviously would really depend on the situation. If they have a gun, for example, like the proximity that I would get to that person, I probably would be less likely. But also, I'm kind of a dumbass. So I don't know if I'd be the dumbass who would like rush in, or if I'd be the dumbass who would like freeze, because when it comes to like gun violence, for example, or like somebody having a weapon, I don't have a lot of experience with that. So I'm not totally sure. This is why I actually think like some level of seeing and encountering violence can be really helpful to kind of train your system how to best respond. In large part because I think, for example, a lot of kidnappings, even though I couldn't like physically stop most kidnappers, just me being there screaming and trying to intervene probably makes it way less likely that that person's going to still steal the child, right? Because now it's just like not worth it.
Him in the first episode when he was arrested, he was scared, pretending to be innocent, and he felt like a child. Another moment from Owen that I thought was great acting was the breakdown that he had when he smashed the hot chocolate across the table, got worked up, and then used that very situation against Bryony and was putting words in her mouth, showing that he knew that he'd messed up by acting like that.
How do you prevent manipulators from using your empathy for their own gain? I believe that it is possible, but I feel a certain type of person will confuse kindness for weakness.
It's a really good question. Thanks for the 10 quid as well. How do you prevent manipulators from using your empathy for their own gain? This is why the dialectic, again, I don't know if I came up with this or if I heard this. This has been a saying that I have had and used for a really long time with like high risk youth that do a lot of naughty things, but are also, they've got a lot of pain, which is that things can be understandable, but that doesn't make it excusable, right? So for example, when we're talking about obvious bad things that somebody has done, we might say something like, well, I understand the psyche behind the person that does this bad thing. But it's important to also include in there, but that doesn't make the bad thing okay. The bad thing is still bad, right? When a drug addict abuses their kids and steals from their family, because we understand addiction and the effect that it has on our thinking and how it basically steals our priority system and puts drugs at number one over even our own children, right? I think it's good that society's been able to engage in the space of being like, we understand why that behavior is occurring. But I think all of us would agree, but that doesn't make it okay that they're doing these things, right? It obviously doesn't make it okay. This is why most addiction treatment centers have some element of forgiveness and apology and kind of accountability in the process of recovery. Because when you do lots of bad stuff, even if it's understandable, even if it's the first time you've had a major mental health breakdown and you're being nasty and irritable and pushing your friends away, even though it's understandable, it's still hurtful to the people that you're doing it to. And that doesn't make it excusable. So I guess the way that you prevent people from taking advantage of it is holding pretty strong lines about like what isn't okay behaviorally, right? So when they're like, yeah, but I did it because of this and this and this, you can say, I understand. it doesn't make it okay. It's still wrong. You still owe that person. You still have to repent and, where possible, correct harm that you've done. But I understand why, right? That's, in my mind, how you do that. I also think that if you're a victim of somebody, the way that you can engage in empathy is going to look very differently than if you're like a third person, right? This is why I would never like expect like the victim's family to engage well with Jamie at all. But I do expect the psychologists to. Zed Snapper has really strong feelings about psychopaths. Also, Zed Snapper, we probably shouldn't lock up people before they've done a crime. That is just like way too, what's that Tom Cruise show about predicting like future crimes and arresting people before then and stuff? I always forget it. I reference it all the time. I have a hard time understanding if people believe, I mean, it's interesting because if you, for example, this isn't entirely related, but for example, pathological liars, for example, are very interesting because there's a really big argument in the literature about whether or not deep down they know that they're lying, right? Like if I tell a lie, if I say my hair is red, right? I know that I'm lying, and most people will always know that they're lying. And the reason why it can be really hard to hold a whole bunch of complex lies is you have to hold all the lore in your mind that you know to be false. Whereas with pathological liars, there's kind of this theory that the lies that they tell become the truth, which is why they can be so consistent in recalling the lies and why their lies can be so complex and well, like, bred out. So what you're saying of like, I think people who do evil things, if you peel back the layers, they actually know it's BS. The problem is that there can be a lot of cope, right? A lot of cope where people, I think, have genuinely convinced themselves that it's okay. Now, I think a lot of people that have genuinely convinced themselves that some like negative behavior, you know, I remember having a client that was like pretty abusive to their kids, but they had convinced themselves that because it was so understandable, they were a victim actively of abuse at that time and had been raised like with a much more severe abusive situation. So they were like a little bit physically abusive to their kids and very verbally abusive, but they grew up in a home that was sexually, physically, and verbally, like extreme abuse on every tier. And so they had genuinely convinced themselves of being like, I mean, my kids should get it. Like, I was so messed up. Like, yeah, I was wrong, but I was so messed up. So like my kids should probably get it, right? And there had to be like conversations that I would have with this client of being like, you having more tragedy in your background doesn't diminish the tragedy and the wrongdoing that you did to them. Like, it doesn't justify it, right? And we would like have to go back and forth about this. So I do think that deep down, there's people who do bad acts that genuinely think it's okay. I just think most of those people could potentially be convinced out of it, but it might take time. I think most people. -10 to -5 ain't the win you think it is. -10 to -5 is a massive win, just to be clear. If you have a client that's like at -10, like just, you know, a forensic client, right? Or they're just in and out of jail constantly. They're constantly violent. They're constantly assaulting people. And then they work on their anger regulation to the level that they're still like screaming at people and being nasty, but they're no longer like assaulting people. That's a really big deal. -5 to -10 is huge, assuming that we're like engaging in that in like any level of like seriousness. Just to be clear.
Even him being taken away at the end, we really bought into the fact that Jamie wanted that validation from Bryony and that he'd become attached to her and formed a genuine connection with her, but he couldn't stand the fact that she didn't actually like him and that it was all just professional. The innocence at the start to the complete guilt that was there by the end showed the true range in the young actor, and it was the time where we really got to see the evil that was within.
They're talking about the -5 being the child's abuse. I don't get it. -10 to -5 isn't all. Feel like my response stays the same. -10 to -5 ain't the win you think it is. Oh, they're responding to the client. I understand. Sorry, Lithics. I think I misunderstood you a little bit too. Sorry.
the boy, and Owen Cooper played a large part in that. The use of sound and lighting. This is something in the episode that I feel went under the radar, but contributed massively to the success of it and the immersive nature that it held, as well as the single-take shot that was present, which quite literally circled around the table like an interrogation and would then also go in for close-ups when emotions needed to be seen. There were also other mediums that were played with, such as lighting and sound. For example, the speech which connected heavily to Eddie's breakdown in episode 4, where Jamie spoke to Bryony about his father taking him to football, but him not being any good, and ultimately seeing his father looking away because he was ashamed of him. The background noise in the room fell to complete silence to really allow that piece of dialogue to cut through. Plus, the lighting in the room went a lot darker, showing that we were entering a dark part of Jamie's mind and that it was difficult for him to go to it. Another time this was present.
I feel like this analysis, like I just agree with them. This guy knows way more about sound and lighting than I do. Based. I love listening to movie analysts in this way to like just learn about lighting and sound, just to like think about for like my own future movie consumption and maybe content creation, right? But this also reminds me why like movie snobs are like some of the worst critics. Where he's like so on point with his analysis of the acting itself, like all the technical stuff of what like makes cinema great. And just like somehow in the midst of it just missed the entire point of the episode. It's so like a British man to impose his visceral disgust and maybe even self-hatred that he sees and feels pulled by this boy onto the woman psychologist, when I suspect most women, for example, who watch this didn't even view Jamie as the evil boy, but empathized with the psychologist's struggle of being a woman talking to a boy killer and also seeing him as this child. And all of the complexities and difficulties of this child's done a very evil action and is a child, but the child has really bad ideas that are obviously harmful to the level of murder. And he's very dysregulated, which makes me believe that it's not necessarily the case that he wouldn't do this behavior again without like serious rehabilitation. And it's still a child that we're going to be locking into jail, you know? I'm not going to lie, before I started episode 4, I was also just tired, but I turned it off and I was like, that's enough British accent for today. I'm good. I'm joking.
Was when Jamie was talking about what he could have done with Kate if he actually did what he wanted to. The room fell silent again, but this time with a close-up on Bryony, we heard her breathing intensely and her heartbeat pounding as well. Something which really allowed us to capture the fear and disgust that was in her mind, as obviously she couldn't express that to him because she had him right where she wanted him with the answers that he was giving.
She had him right where he wanted him. She was a hero trying to catch the evil bad guy, this 13-year-old boy. The evil 13-year-old boy.
Like, bro, crazy way to like project into her. Or maybe I'm projecting onto her. I don't really see like extreme disgust. I see some level of disgust. Isn't he evil? Probably not. He did an evil thing. He very much did an evil thing. Man, y'all need more Christians in your life, apparently. Remember when Christians said, don't hate the sinner, hate the sin, okay? And they weren't really being that serious. Y'all need more of that. But be real about it, okay? Don't hate the sinner, hate the sin. You look as you could eat less snacks. I don't think you mean that, Busen. Tell you what, Busen, you donate me $100 and I'll give my dog the rest of the taquitos, okay? But I'm gonna give it to her off stream because I don't know if I trust that you're not like a bestiality type person. $100. I'll feed her the rest of my taquitos, though. Also, you don't need to comment on my weight. I'm actually a pretty healthy person. Go to the gym every other day. Just kidding. Well, I do, but...
Another technique on the audio that was used was the incorporation of the...
I care about your dog. I can tell you care about my dog. I'm just trying to figure out if you care about my dog too much.
Static, heavy rain and wind sound that was present in
Don't moderate him yet. He might
this
give me
sound
$100.
would often rise up in volume when Jamie would get more irate and questions would be asked to him that he wanted to avoid. and often it would then be followed by the silence when he'd answer them. This was something that really allowed the tension to build, and then often when his temper would cause him to fizz over, we were almost ready for it because the sound had subconsciously been preparing us for it. So the use of visuals and audio was something that I definitely appreciated in the episode, and it contributed to the environment and atmosphere. The subject matter of the episode. The whole intention of this episode was one that was really interesting to include into the 4-part series. As the showrunners have said themselves, this wasn't about showcasing the end-to-end process of murder to conviction and then sentencing. This was about showing how it impacted each and every touchpoint along the course of the journey. With this episode being focused around a psychologist entering the facility, meeting Jamie, and aiming to build a profile about his character to work out if he was aware of the situation, the meaning of death, and what being found guilty meant, was a great decision. Especially the fact that we kind of saw him being lured into a false sense of security and ending up admitting what he did by
A false sense of security.
Just, this guy doesn't understand anything about forensic psychologists. It wasn't a false sense of security. It was a legitimate sense of security. She was genuinely, when she said, "I'm not trying to trick you," I don't know why this guy watching just doesn't believe her, but she meant it. She wasn't trying to trick him. She was genuinely trying to understand him. The good, the bad, the ugly, because she wanted to understand how it was possible. Well, she was, professionally required. How it was possible that a 13-year-old boy killed another girl in anger. That's a pretty insane situation. I hate how this guy has been like, man, she made such such incredible plots and toys and tricks to lure him. It's like, that is, just so it's clear, psychologists are not doing this. All you're doing right now, British man, is reinforcing every bit of fear that actual incels have about the mental health field and about women in general. That is not what she was doing, unless we just buy into this idea that I guess women, particularly women psychologists, can't help but do nasty little tricksies to their clients. Crazy. Incel masters shouldn't be a bit older when they watch the content. The boy wasn't even into the Manosphere. That's what everyone's getting wrong about the show. I don't understand how everyone has watched the show yesterday and they've just rewritten it in their head. The boy isn't even into the Manosphere. He's heard about it a little bit. He's mostly a normal boy with clear rage issues who was being bullied using Manosphere generalized culture insults. You know how the Manosphere is no longer just the Manosphere? It's kind of gotten its fingers into general audience and into the general culture. He was being called an incel. He didn't think he was an incel. He was being mocked as an incel, right? He was being made fun of for being a weak, bad, sad boy. Just want to make it clear, okay? Because everyone keeps forgetting. Thanks for all the subs, guys, on Twitch. Look at YouTube. You're getting creamed by Twitch right now. Okay, if you guys enjoy me, to be honest, I appreciate the subs and the memberships. Getting called an incel at 13. Yeah, because 13-year-olds are stupid, right? They're just going to it's exactly the type of thing 13-year-olds will say to each other. They will watch because they're very enmeshed into pop culture. They're going to hear people constantly calling each other incels in unserious ways, which is why I hate when people use the words like groomer and incel and all these other things for like small bad behaviors, because kids do see this and then they use it as a weapon to attack other kids with. That's what happened. It's just the new word for loser or virgin. It's just the equivalent of virgin. The problem is virgin just meant you were a loser forever, and incel means you're a loser and you're evil forever, which apparently the brain pilot guy just didn't understand as part of the point. How will you ever beg anybody to each other? Should at 12 I was called a rapist. Jesus, that's crazy. Also, if you guys enjoy food stuff, I would really appreciate anyone using my subscription for HelloFresh. It's actually a pretty slick deal, not gonna lie. Basically, you get a massive discount, up to 10 free meals, and you get a free high-protein protein item for life, which would be like a drink or high-protein cookies for life, which is kind of a big one. You need to use a new subscription account. It just needs to be a new subscription. Okay, you use my account, POGHF155479. You can just click the link. But honestly, a lot of people like moan and whine right now about YouTubers and people having sponsors. It's basically one of the best ways for your content creators to make money. And it gives you free food rather than just like having cute emotes on my chat.
Jamie was relatively closed off about the entire situation for most of the interaction, with him putting his arms in front of him as if it was some kind of shield. But then once he slipped up and then later went on to describe about how Kate was weak and that he saw her weakness as an opportunity and that he could have done anything with that knife, even touched her, but he chose not to. It showed that the writing was done so well, because after, it was as if Bryony had all of the information that she wanted, and it went from her being friendly with him due to the profession that she was in, to her then switching to be extremely formulaic in her questions and saying, "Thank you for your time," which felt so unemotional and not personal. All done to speed up the process and to enable her to get out of that room as quickly as possible. Showing that not only were victims impacted, families impacted, students and friends impacted, but also professionals that were dealing with the case were impacted too. I actually think the sheer disgust that she was feeling was summed up best when she picked up that sandwich and then realized that Jamie had had his mouth around it and she threw it straight back down to the table, showing that she couldn't touch anything that this evil monster had. Whilst many of the episodes were powerful for a number of different reasons, this episode was really the one that stood out to me. It was the first episode where it contrasted the others in the sense that it was a lot more intimate, and rather than there being chaos about the case and the reaction of everybody that could have been directly impacted, it was more so just about understanding Jamie's mind.
Disgust would be out of her character. Yeah. It'd be reasonable enough to like not want to take the sandwich or whatever. But... So he killed one girl out of feeling slighted, more like bullied. He killed one girl after being bullied.
Honestly, it was the perfect episode of the show, and it's one that's going to live long in the memory when I think back to it. So, there you have it. Why Adolescence Episode 3 is perfect.
That's I totally forgot about that ending. I think there is something really interesting.
Also, just about understanding.
I feel like this guy didn't touch into that I actually thought was really brilliant in the show in general, in showing, which is this. So the reason it's really important for you to understand the psychology behind why this boy killed this specific girl. Because he was getting bullied by a lot of people. He wasn't just getting bullied by her, but she was one person doing some level of targeted. And in this episode, we learn that at some point in the school year, she sent partial nudes to another boy because she was into him. And then that boy ended up sharing her it was like her topless with, basically it sounds like the school, right? It sounds like her photos went everywhere. And she was getting bullied brutally over her nudes being shared around. And Jamie, the perpetrator, realized that even though he's claiming that he wasn't that into her, that she might be an easier person to approach to date because she was kind of down on her luck and everyone was being mean to her and she'd been attracted by boys and everyone's calling her a whore. So he approached her to try and get a date, basically, to take her to, I think, a fair. And she said to him, "You know, I'm not that desperate." And he was also going around kind of publicly defending her, saying that she wasn't a whore and stuff like that. So he was not just going up to her once and being like, "Hey, you're soft," but he was also intentionally kind of taking her side. And it's very interesting because as a reaction to that, probably a little bit out of shame, she kind of targets him, right? Starts calling him an incel on Instagram, making posts, making comments, a lot of her comments getting lots of likes, where she's basically mocking him for being an incel loser, right? So his anger being directed at her specifically is very interesting, but it also outlines this really interesting kind of like sexual shame dynamic that I think oftentimes laces its way through gender dynamics, right? Where when we feel shame, sometimes even the people who are maybe in good intention or not so good intention, which it sounds like his intentions in it were less than just pure. The people who try to comfort us, reach out to us, if they don't do it in certain ways, they can suddenly become the major victim of the shame that we feel and the kind of the blame and the vomit that comes out of us as a result, right? She feels super shamed. He approaches her and is defending her, and her response is to be super mean and nasty to him. Probably in part because him approaching her and whatnot made her feel really embarrassed, right? You have to remember, she probably also knew that he had seen the photos of her and didn't have a relationship with her before that. Yep, exactly, right? Spiteful behavior for, I mean, yeah, in this show, every one of the kids is kind of sucky. They're just also kids, right? So she's been shamed with the boy that she likes the most. Then a really unpopular boy is defending her and approaches her for the fair, which is probably assuming that he's seen it. And so it's interesting, though, that her rage gets directed at this boy who's lower on the hierarchy. Now, to be clear, the show doesn't go into, it's possible that her rage was also directed at the boy that she shared the image to and to others. It's not super clear, but it's this interesting dynamic of her rage gets directed at him. And as a result of that, his generalized social shame that he feels as being a loser generally, his whole friend group is pretty unpopular. None of them are cool. Also gets redirected at her, right? Which is a very interesting way that I think a lot of times when we feel internalized shame, how one person can suddenly become the source, and like, not just the source, not the source at all. When we feel a lot of shame from like group bullying or group harassment, how one person can suddenly come to symbolize the expression of all of it. And we take out all of the sides of the shame and anger that we feel on that single individual. I think we see this a lot more often in like really close interpersonal relationships, right? This is like the very classic. There's a very famous kind of older Indian story from like East India talking about this dynamic of this very poor working labor man in a very low caste in the Indian caste system, who gets dogged on all day, abused, treated poorly. And then he goes home and he abuses his wife because she's lower than him. So she's the easy target. And then in turn, the mom turns around and abuses her children, right? And so it's this really interesting Indian story where it basically outlines these steps of how shame and abuse and pain from others often begets other pain, but it often gets directed at people lower on the totem pole directly, which is actually, there's an interesting study on, for example, lashing out at a lot of the boys, but from the show, we only see one boy's perspective. I could see her lashing out at a lot of boys. I could also see her only lashing out at this boy because she knows that he's safe, right? So she's getting shamed for being a whore, but she can earn social points by pushing this boy who's already lower on the totem pole lower, thereby to some degree potentially pushing her up by getting a whole bunch of likes, for example, right? This is the way that shame often works. And in retaliation, he does the ultimate evil, which is killing her. And just to be clear, it's made clear on the show as well, her bullying him doesn't make him killing her okay. Right? Obvious. But what's interesting is this cascade way that when we experience shame and pain, we often target it down. And in some ways, he targets it down, right? Because what does he do? Well, he can't get back at her verbally. She kind of keeps dunking on him every time he's approached her in school. But where does he have like the hierarchical power? In physical altercation, which is where it gets expressed, right? He sees her, he's got this knife from his friend, he follows her, and ultimately in like rage, especially if you watch the video where he assaults her, she shoves him, and because they're 13, she's a little bit bigger than him because he hasn't quite hit puberty, and girls are a little bit bigger than boys until the boys hit puberty, which is usually like half a year to a year later than most girls on average. So she shoves him down, and he turns around and does the one thing that he has physical dominance over her, which is stabbing her with the knife, right? Which is this interesting story as well about how like pain and shame cascades down the hierarchical line. This is why, there's like that classic story of like the dad who was abused by his dad turning around and abusing his children, right? And those children growing up and maybe abusing their partners or their spouse, or like these dynamics, and how pain begets pain, begets pain, begets pain, begets pain, begets pain. It reminds me of, there's a stupid book that I love called The Wandering Inn, and I'm at book like 12 by now. It's this like Reddit isekai that's been turned into an audiobook, but genuinely, it's the writing quality is like okay. What's brilliant about it is the writer's ability to infuse very common kind of archetypes and tropes into a story. And there's this goblin group, and there's this cycle that occurs with goblins and humans, where humans kill goblins and goblins kill humans and humans kill goblins and goblins kill humans, and they go back and forth, and they always feel justified for their pain and their hatred of each other because they can always point to when an evil was done to them by the other side. And there's this goblin leader who's constantly going, how do we get out of this? Right? And she's the goblin leader's very young and kind of goes like, it's a cycle. It's a cycle. And the only way we break the cycle is to stop the cycle, which is like the pain begets pain, begets pain. We see this with intergenerational trauma, for example. Pain begetting pain, begetting pain, begetting pain. And this is where I think rehabilitative justice can be really powerful, where the point in large part of rehabilitative justice is to step off of the cycle, right? There's a place for punitive justice. I think it's the correct thing that people who murder people go to jail. I think that's good, right? We want there to be a consequence for your misdeed, your evil deed. But the whole point of rehabilitative justice is finding a way off of the cycle of pain begetting pain forever and ever and ever, because there will always be somebody underneath you on the hierarchy. There's always somebody that you can attack. And so rehabilitative justice, especially if you look at like the Canadian Indigenous model, is super interesting because I feel like it straddles so well this line between forgiveness and accountability. I don't know all rehabilitative justice models. The one I'm most familiar with is the Indigenous one from Canada. It's often viewed as like it's at least the one that I was taught and learned. Buson's like, you're so wrong. You got to feed that dog a nugget. Which, in the Indigenous model of rehabilitative justice, what they do is they take the perpetrator and their family and they make them sit across with counselors and like people, like it's a whole ordeal. Usually like the chief is there and like the wise woman or wise person, and they make them sit across from the victim or the victim's family, right? And they make them sit there and they listen to the victim's family, and they have to answer questions at the victim's family, or assuming the victim is still alive, the victim themselves as well, ask them. And what's expected in rehabilitative justice circle, at least an Indigenous one, is some level of accountability occurring on part of the person who did wrong, right? Being like, I was wrong to do this. I'm ashamed of what I've done to your family. And ideally some level of like forgiveness, of basically, again, forgiveness doesn't mean it was okay, no wrong was done anymore. It's going, I forgive you despite everything that you've cost me. I'm canceling your debt, not because you deserve it, but because it's the good thing to do, right? That's what forgiveness is. Because everyone like just turns all these nice things like empathy and forgiveness into just like weak, silly, pathetic things, which is not what it is. And I think in many ways, it's interesting. I haven't finished the 4th episode, but this poses to me this question that our society is really struggling with, which is we have this history of men, particularly white men, kind of subjugating others around them, particularly in North America and kind of the dominant cultural hegemon of North America and Europe, right? Of dominantly white, rich men having power over others and using that power to do harm to others. And as we've balanced out that power increasingly, I think what has happened is that some good things have happened and some bad things have happened. And one of the bad things that's happened is pain begetting pain, right? So the women's movement that was trying to emancipate women while I think it's still doing that to some degree of trying to empower women and femininity, has also got branches of it that are very interested in shaming men. And the men who often are most subjugated to the shaming of men is young men. And then we see young men having a snap right and becoming increasingly angry, right? And blaming it all on women when it's more complicated than that, right? It's not just women. It's the fact that our economic system doesn't have space for labor, which is what most young men occupied, and a two household income is just necessary for this income. That men don't uniquely offer women money. That's not what they bring uniquely to the table. They have to bring other things to the table, but we haven't socialized men for at least hundreds of years in how to do that specifically, because the main thing that we attached a male value to historically was GDP. And so like we have these pains begetting pains, and so we see like increasing like incel misogyny, and in response to the increasing misogyny, we see increasing misandry. And it's tough because at every step of the way I look at this and I go, I understand why rad femmes hate men so much. Like I get it. Like I just get it. Makes sense. Almost all the violence in the entire world is done by men. You might be like, but it's done to men most. It's still being done by men. Women aren't doing it, right? You guys are the core of the problem in this regard. And yet, it's understandable why young men who haven't done these things but are being treated like pariahs or treating as like problems are becoming more angry as they're paying the consequences of former men who did bad things, right? And it's just this line and line and line again of pain begetting pain, begetting pain, begetting pain, begetting pain. And then we're sitting here being like, how do we redeem our society? It's probably shaming people more. And it's like, it's probably not. There are certain things that do have to be excised out that are principally wrong, that you go to jail for, like murder, right? But at some point, rehabilitative justice is going to be needed. It's going to be needed in our society. We are cooked without it. I feel like I'm bad at endings. And that's why, if you guys believe all this and you think that this is a beautiful, important vision for the world, I guess this is how I'll end it. This is what Nick will probably send me. I think what's really important is that you gather around and form communities that believe in this vision of like stepping off of the cycle of pain, of like creating forgiveness. If you think that the way that the left or a feminized space is crafting masculinity is kind of soy and weak and doesn't appeal to you, that's fine. I broadly agree with you. But the answer can't be just hating them. The answer has to be then make it better. You have to make it better, because if there's one thing that we've probably all learned, especially for men, but as adults in general, is that if you're not going to stick up for you, nobody else will, and you can't expect them to. Okay? So get in those communities. Find people who believe similar values. Fight to maintain your moral principles. Figure out what your moral principles are. What do you think leads to a better world, that leads to a better you? And embody those things. And don't wiggle around on them depending on who pisses you off the most. Hold them for the people you like and for the people that you hate. And be clear and really thoughtful about what the truly intolerable actions are, right? It might be being anti-democratic. If you think that democracy is truly the best system right now, then being anti-democratic might be your intolerable thing. And if there's one thing that I know that is truly intolerable, it's not using my coupon to get a HelloFresh free high protein box item. Because if we're gonna make the world a better place, we should do so with big jacked muscles, okay? Okay, guys, this HelloFresh payout thing is boogaloo, okay? So first of all, HelloFresh, I'm not even memeing. Every time HelloFresh is like, you want to do a sponsorship with us? I'm like, yes, because A, it means that I get like 2 or 3 meals typically for super cheap, and it pays so well as a content creator, and I actually love HelloFresh. It's definitely one of my favorite meal subscription programs, and one of my friends and my brother was like big into meal box buying, so I've tried a bunch of them. And HelloFresh consistently always just had like the best shit.